techniques. We're trained in something called life space crisis intervention. And even just to use a physical restraint, we had to exhaust all of our other options before we did that. And I don't understand why we as people without any kind of, weapon or even like pepper spray or anything like that, we just had our de-escalation techniques, and then if something happened, we had a physical restraint that also had its own limitations. So I don't understand why. I mean, I know that police are supposed to be like protecting us, but if we can figure out how to protect ourselves and the other people that we're taking care of without using this force, why isn't that required training for police officers? It doesn't make any sense.
I think that's excellent. I think that's one of the areas we're all kind of trying to answer that question, especially for here. I mean, I can elaborate more on that as far as Emmaus is concerned. We dove into a lot of their policies and saw a lot of holes in that. One of the biggest things that our officers are getting called out for are behavioral health related issues. And there's that overwhelming need for de-escalation training, but that also only goes so far. Getting officers trained in a 6-hour training course is not as enough as it needs to be. So one of the areas we're looking at to change that is by integrating a behavioral health unit into. I know different areas will vary on how they approach this, but making sure that our officers our department's also being run by behavioral health specialists. Like, I'm not talking about extended training for an officer. Yeah, I think that's important. I mean, it's kind of crappy that an officer is trained to tell the difference if that backpack on the corner has got a bomb in it or not, or drugs in it. And what do? They call the canine unit in, right? So they're trained in these techniques. So there's an element of, they need to have that training right now. There's no time like years ago. But there also is the need to have real behavioral health specialists, like you're saying, like as yourself, who this is their job.
I think that they should also need to. I've noticed, like, in places that I've worked, I worked at Kids Peace for a while, but nursing students would come in and they'd have to observe. And I feel like police officers should have to, like, as part of their training, spend some time like in a mental health facility, spend some time around people on the autism spectrum with like intellectual disabilities, so they can identify and learn how to, work with people like that, because there's no reason why somebody that has this much power and this much availability of deadly force should have to take less amount of training than a nurse.
Actually, there is a reason, and one of the original reasons for the police to be formed was, of course, to capture escaped slaves. And so, one of the things that we're talking about is the fact that the reason why in the year of our Lord 2020, all of this stuff is still normalized. It's because it has been ingrained so hard that if they get the training that makes them able to make those changes, there's no guarantee that they're actually going to use that training to save any lives. I am just randomly going to pick on somebody. Spike, do you mind coming off of mute for a second? I'm gonna ask Spike a question. If you look out your closest window, and you see Ryan Velasquez out there, he's wearing nothing but a pair of boxer shorts, and he is singing Blue Moon and doing the worm on your lawn. Who are you going to call, Spike?
To be honest, probably no one. If it goes to like an hour, then I probably will call. I actually don't know who I will call because I don't want to call the police.
Exactly. So in your mind, you don't want to call the police, but you don't know what number you would dial in order to see if this guy was okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So if somebody said, go ahead.
Sorry. I think the closest person I will call is my mom's work. She works at Family Promise and they help people that are homeless. So maybe that's and like with mental issues. So which I'm lucky that I have, because I don't know if I didn't have that, I would call who I would call.
Exactly. And so for a lot of folks, ever since we were 2, there were 3 numbers that were drilled into our head. There are 3 numbers that you are supposed to call if you feel like you need help. There are 3 numbers that you are supposed to call if you feel unsafe or if you feel threatened. And so those 3 numbers are 911. I'm just looking through here really quick. Somebody said that they would call county. Oh goodness, I lost the chat.
County
Sorry.
crisis. Yeah.
County crisis. And
Yeah.
then Cologne said that county crisis would also bring the police. Jay Cologne, do you mind coming off of mute and telling us, do you have any experience with that happening?
I am a trained counselor, and so there was a time in my life where I worked for children and youth, and so there were times where county crisis had to be called for X, Y, or Z reasons, but every time they show up with the police, and a lot of times if the county crisis worker, because a lot of times they're entry-level positions, and they're not, you know, they don't have a lot of longevity in the counseling world or the social work world, some of them, the police tend to take, you know, a bigger stance in that situation, and sometimes a small situation can get out of hand because the police are there, because the minute, you know, a client sees the police officer, they get intimidated and they sometimes get out of control.
Exactly. And so Patrick McGee said that it's important to think about how we care for mental health. Hospitals are underfunded in this regard and resemble jail. People are thrown into crisis and then criminalized. And so one of the things that Lehigh Valley Stands Up is doing is we are calling to defund the police. And so the reason for that is the police have, in Allentown and Bethlehem, the police have 35% of the city budget goes to police. And they say, well, police need to, you know, respond to all these things. Police need to be able to answer all of these questions. Police need to be able to do all these things. But we know that there's another set of 3 numbers that people can call. The United Way currently has a lot of different resources that are available to folks by calling 211. And it looks like we have somebody from Pocono United Way. Do you mind telling us a little bit, Michael, about the programs that you run, and if you had, if you had a budget of $35 million, the way that, or excuse me, of $40 million, the way that the police do in some of these areas, how would you be able to use that to more accurately defend your community?
Wow, great question. And I'm so glad that you brought up 211. For those that are not familiar with that number, it is the comprehensive information referral hotline for all health and human services. A lot of the work that we're doing in the Pocono Mountains right now is around cultural competency, which starts with cultural humility, and making sure that there are improved communication lines, but also recognizing that that starts within our school districts. So we're spending a lot of time working with educators, and one of the main conversations that we're having is changing the conversation. You know, for those that are familiar with the topic of preschool to prison pipeline, we want to change a different pipeline to make sure that we have Black and brown students that are pursuing the field of education and then becoming educators themselves. Creating these cohorts of Black and brown students that can pursue higher degrees of education and then influence their community. We're also spending a lot of time working with just our nonprofit and business communities to make sure that there is appropriate representation on board of directors, in hiring practices. Several businesses have contacted us to talk about doing an internal and external audit of their hiring practices, their evaluations. Again, recognizing that there are those microaggressions and implicit biases that have really matriculated within promotions and within the hiring practices and promotion practices of businesses in our community.
So some of the, some of the resources that the United Way provides through 211, for example, if Ryan's out there in his boxer briefs doing the worm and somebody dials 211, what might happen?
Yeah, so that is, as somebody mentioned about county crisis being a service. In the Poconos, we actually have a street outreach team that does go out and interact with individuals that that are in crisis all the time. And so often what we try to do is really create that relationship again with not just the police, but also with the crisis workers. And often now we're getting to the point where police are willing to call crisis to get their perspective and say, do you know about Ryan, his habits, his location, triggers. And we just have some great crisis workers that, as spoken about before, the de-escalation tactics to really involve our healthcare systems. But again, healthcare could only do so much if it's not culturally competent and culturally culturally humble in itself and sensitive. So we're spending some time now with our local health institutions, which are also mirroring those of the Lehigh Valley, being LVH and St. Luke's.
Exactly. Thank you so much. So one of the things that we say when we say defund the police is that what we want to do is we want to take resources away from officers who might be using excessive force when as I'm sorry, I can't remember the social worker's name, but or the care worker, but they don't need to be using any force. A lot of times this is their most important tool and they don't use it. And so in a lot of the instances that I mentioned earlier, they had the opportunity to talk someone down or to calm someone, and they didn't. Mike, do you mind showing that last slide? Not the very last slide, but the second to last one that was just up. So Ryan is going to talk a little bit more about like what happens, like who do we call when police murder, and what are who can you contact when something happens, when not just when they kill, but when you've experienced something like if a cop has mistreated you or handled something that you don't find to be quite right, who are you supposed to contact? So Ryan, can you go into a little bit about what we found and what we didn't find?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, it was kind of when we started talking about this question and trying to figure that out, it was really sad, actually. I had to find some of these answers through forums, chat boxes, and all sorts of other things of what people have experienced, and then pursue these links on my own and you just can't call the police department up on the police. So now some bigger police departments, which I'd be very wary of, they have internal affairs, and I'm not sure how efficient that has been. I know in most of America is made up of small towns, and they have small town police departments, and they don't have these programs available or even use them. So you could attempt to file, and you should file a formal complaint with the police department, the chief or whoever is in charge, of sergeant, however that will work. But there's some steps further that I don't think we actually realize that we can do here. You have the Department of Justice has a civil rights division. If you're being harassed or you have a case of brutality, that's why they're there. That's a civil rights violation. So the biggest thing that we can do is making sure that we're getting these complaints into the Department of Justice. Now, the Department of Justice, they in their civil rights division, they get a substantial amount of complaints, which again I found rather disturbing in itself. I think our own Pennsylvania Attorney General gets about like 20,000 a year or something like that, and it's just an astronomical number when you think about like complaints. Now, hopefully, a good portion of them are not as crazy, but it's still just it's a disturbing thing. So you have your Department of Justice for the federal end that their civil rights division. You also have the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office. Again, there are two links here that you can actually file a complaint. But there's also something further that I think we need to consider doing, and that is being vocal about it. Activism is exposing. It's really part in this scenario. Activism, we're exposing the flaws in our system, and we're bringing it to public light, whether that's media outlets, rallying in our parks, making signs, putting them up on our porches, whatever we need to do, social media. There's all these different outlets. One of the quickest ways we've been able to get meetings with government officials is at this post-rally. So another thing that you can look into, and again, this will vary on your location. I know Allentown, I believe, has a human relations committee that you can reach out to, your local activist organizations. I welcome for us in Emmaus, if there's ever an incident with the Equal Rights Coalition, for anyone to reach out to us and try to figure out, we will help you go through these steps to make something happen. Yes, I see Arthur. Yes, they have a civil rights division as well. Just kind of catching up here. What can be done if the department doesn't release the officer's name? That's an interesting, that's a really interesting topic, because in discussing things with other police chiefs in the county, Lehigh County, I'm speaking for specifically, there's a privacy policy in there. A lot of the problems we have right now currently with our departments are policy and procedure. And there's certain things like your job. If you get laid off of your job, you have rights to not have public, that being public. They can't, a lot of departments can't legally just state to the public or at a press conference these individuals' names. So there, I think one of the slides that Ashley had there on the incident in South Whitehall, I believe they ran into a similar situation where they couldn't release the officer's name too quickly. They're not permitted because of their policy to say anything or make a public statement about an officer was fired for misconduct that maybe had numerous complaints filed against them and how they were conducting themselves in roads and traffic stops and all these other areas. So there's
another thing that one of the local House representatives put forward and stands by, I think it was Pete Schweier, who is asking that for 30 days following any incident of police violence, that the officer's name not be released. And so that can be dangerous as well, because the reason why we're asking is not so we can go throw eggs at their house. It's so that we know whether or not the officer is still out on the streets patrolling after they have been convicted of something. I see in the chat that Jill is saying, what about all the good things that police do? They have helped me. You can't just talk about negative things. Well, Jill, I would invite you to come off of mute in just a minute, but this section is titled Police Brutality. And so one of the things that we are fighting for as we are fighting for peace and justice is not just the individual things that police do. You know, I've had police help me jumpstart my car before. I have had police officers come and they said that they got it. Sorry about that. I'm back. But I have been helped by police officers as well, because they have taken an oath to protect and serve. And some of them do that. But if we're talking about bad apples, and we're not talking about the fact that the roots of the apple tree are actually what is diseased, then we have a lot more problems than just picking out one or two good officers that actually do their job. And so for officers that just do what they're supposed to do, it's not something that we're really trying to. It's not something that we're trying to hide, that officers do their job, but we shouldn't laud officers who are just doing what they're supposed to do, and at the same time laud officers who are literally killing people. In the case in 1997, one of the officers that was involved in the shooting on Mr. Herco was actually awarded Officer of the Year for his role in that drug raid. And the drug raid where they burned the house down and so found nothing containing any kind of drugs. So that's a really good point, that, hashtag not all cops, but we know that all cops are underneath a system that enables them to do these really, really terrible things. And the system isn't going to change by itself. We need to change it. And so that's why we're titled Police Brutality. Peter says in Lehigh County, we also have a DA who seems unwilling to disclose information and always take the police aside, ignoring his responsibility to the people and to the community. And that is absolutely right. And I can say, as Lehigh Valley stands up, get your lawyer friends together and tell them to update their LinkedIn's, because we are actively working on replacing Jim Martin.
That's actually what I was going to say next. Actually, that comes down to voting. If we're unhappy, and they've been, Lehigh County and Northampton County have had DAs who have sat way too long in their positions. And this is why, this is one of the reasons voting is so crucial. Is, you know, we get bombarded by the national spotlight of voting that most people don't even realize who their local officials are, that they get voted in as well. So this is, you know, this is one of the most important things. Your day-to-day stuff that happens to you every single day is more so done by your local politicians, your district attorneys. And if they've been sitting there too long and promoting bad policy, then we need to make a change about that. Just because you're familiar with the name on the ballot doesn't mean they deserve your vote. Just because you've heard the name before doesn't mean they deserve your vote. So it's important to get the word out there. Get, like Ashley's saying, get time to get all the lawyer friends, get their LinkedIn's updated, because we need some fresh ideas. We need some futuristic ideas, innovative and ideas that coming in, rather than just picking up where we left off with the status quo and allowing that revolving door of judicial nonsense to keep plaguing our society. So I just wanted to elaborate on that.
The requirements, thank you so much, Ryan. The requirements to be a district attorney are that you be 25 years of age, that you have been a lawyer in the Pennsylvania bar for a year, and that you be registered in that county for at least a year. So that is another reason why folks should register, not just so that they can vote for other people, but so that people can vote for you. You know, like I said, like, we're out here today in Center City, in Lehigh and Northampton County, and in Monroe. You can go to the voter registration office and you can vote on demand. You can say, I'm a registered voter, I want to vote. If you live in Lehigh County, you can come by and get masks, you can get hoodies. Other places, they don't have that, but we're working on it. I'm gonna open it up to some questions, but I'm first gonna ask Mike to ask the question that he dropped in the chat for Ryan.
Okay, listen, I'm going to have to wrap it up now, Ashley and Ryan. This has been really fantastic, and I want to thank both of you for really giving us a powerhouse panel to open up this conference. So really psyched about that, and thank you to every single participant who has been here. I want you to look at the chat now, if you will, and see a question that is there that I'm going to copy into the chat. This question will be asked at the end of every single panel at this conference, and is, do you think that Northampton Community College administrators, faculty, and students is doing enough to address the concerns and problems brought to our attention by this panel? Now, this one's police brutality, but the question will be panel specific for each one, of course. If either of you would like to briefly answer this question now, Ryan or Ashley, go ahead. Anybody else who's participating can go ahead and type your answer to that question into the chat, and we're going to record those and save them and make a chronicle of those the answers to that question as we go. But we're pretty much out of time, but I'm going to give both of you a chance to go ahead and address this while we're all still here.
Well, Mike, I think that's a good question. I know we kind of chatted a little bit about that last night. You know, there's a consistent theme here. I don't know if anyone noticed when we're going through these slides on giving examples of police brutality, especially in our local area. There's a consistent theme with behavioral health. That's been a big push of mine. I'm going to continue to push that and advocate for that, and getting the funding to our area to promote better programs. But something occurred to me when I was sitting down with a couple other chiefs of police, and that was, you know, we are so limited. We think being a police officer, as much as we're trying to change that in the future, and what that means right now, things we can do currently is it's not really, being a police officer is not limited to a criminal justice background. So the consistent theme here is behavioral health. I mean, I would like to see that criminal justice umbrella within the college itself open its doors to behavioral health, like psychology or other behavioral health and healthcare majors to take an interest into that. I also think there's some other areas as far as communications. It's a much broader thing. It's if we keep it under that criminal justice umbrella, I mean, are we continuing to perpetuate this by creating officers who are thrown into a bad root system, or we can bring some change about it, bring some variety into the departments itself now, with behavioral health specialists, with communications, with other degree backgrounds that could help diversify and really start to lay new groundwork for what 21st century policing or 21st century community outreach really even looks like. That's as best as I could do on answering.
Yeah, that's great. And by the way, I have to apologize. I was a little bit premature in calling an end to this panel. We still have 20 more minutes. We have until 10:45. So
can we actually
Ashley, if you want to answer, or if anybody else wants to try to answer this question that's there in the chat.
I'll go for it a little bit.
Okay.
So I originally, my degree is from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, but it took me 10 years to graduate as I moved down to the Lehigh Valley before I actually got a chance to walk across the stage. So I took my very last history credit that I needed at NAC. And so one of the things that I really got to learn from that history course was not only reading a lot about the history, but having discussions with classmates about, what really is, what does racism look like? What did it look like before? What does it look like now? How is it affecting the people? And I'm afraid I don't remember that teacher's name, but it was something that was really, really helpful. When we're talking about history, to make sure that we're not erasing anyone's history.
Yeah, great comment. The reason we're putting this question out here, of course, is so that we're all keeping firmly in mind the idea that this conference is not just going to end on Thursday, and that it really is a long prelude to all the actions that we might take as a community to decrease instances of police brutality and decrease instances of all the other social injustices that this conference is addressing. So that's why it's there written that way. And that's why it's directed to NCC, because of course we're the ones putting on the conference. What can the college actually do besides having conferences where people talk a lot and say a lot of things and pose a lot of questions? What can the college actually do as a college at a place where classes get taught and conferences happen and people empower themselves by getting degrees, and where knowledge is produced for the whole community? What can the college do? That's what we want to keep talking about. Anybody else who wants to go ahead and answer the question? It looks like I have some people in the chat here. Okay. Aaron says not being on campus. My philosophy student, Aaron Hahn, says, I would hope that the college would have a solid support network for students with mental and physical health, drug and alcohol resources. Absolutely. Peter from sustainedlehighvalley.org says NCC and other colleges should be proactive in leading change, paying more attention to all dimensions of public safety. Thank you, Peter. This is from Michael at Pocono Mountains, and I can't read the rest of that because it's a long name. I apologize. Anyway, Michael, NCC's criminal justice and nursing programs should be steeped in cultural humility, sensitivity, and competency. I would also advocate for BIPOC mentors to encourage students of color to pursue these fields.
I think that's a great answer too. I mean, I want to just kind of elaborate, discuss that for a quick.
Go ahead.
As one of the things I noticed going for like a ride along here in Emmaus is, ironically, I got paired up with the one Puerto Rican officer we have on staff, and it's
what a coincidence.
Right. So, I mean, it was great. He's a great guy. I actually enjoyed, his company there, and the conversations we had were very productive and healthy. The majority of these smaller town police departments, and I think in bigger cities too, and Ashley will probably elaborate on that too, are predominantly white. So culture, bringing that culture into our police departments, encouraging people of minority, descendants of minority, people of color, and whatever it may be, Hispanic, Black, Native American, Indian, all of it. We should really just have this cultural invasion of our police departments. There's something about when you're interacting with someone like that on a day-to-day basis, even for the officers who are white currently on staff, maybe holding these seats, when you know your neighbor in your town or whatever street you live on, when you get to know your neighbor on a different level, you start to develop a sense of empathy or sympathy, and everything. These all build to something. So if I see my neighbor out there, I've lived in this house now for a little over a year, and I've gotten to know the neighborhood a little bit. If I see someone out there's a mechanic struggling with their car and needing to jump, I'm gonna get on. Like, I'm more likely to do that to my neighbor than the guy 3-4 blocks up the street, because I don't know him, right, or her. And that being said, like, if we bring these different cultures into the departments, how much of the impact can that have on the officers that are already there, that have maybe didn't feel the same way? Can we create that level can we create a level of empathy amongst our officers by bringing other cultures into the department itself? And I think these are all things that we can do sooner than later. So I'm definitely a big fan of encouraging people of color or any other minority to be a part of that process and bring what they know in their background and their culture into that, the police department itself. If that helps elaborate on that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Peter from SustainLehighValley.org. I think more diverse police departments can help, but they also face incredible pressure to fit into the existing majority culture. The existing majority culture. Very interesting. Interesting question. And I'm thinking, in light of what you're saying, Ryan, about, diversifying, creating more cultural equity in police departments, about, I guess, what we might call the inverse of that. The problem that seems to be there, more or less large elephant in the room, is the fact that police departments have been infiltrated by white supremacist groups, and as well as the armed services in the United States, and and I'm wondering what you think, or what you may have actually come across in that respect, Ryan, since you've had a lot of contact with cops. Has anything ever raised your suspicions on that, in that regard?
Oh, there's definitely without getting to, I could think of a few incidences even growing up when my a story my father was telling me about how the chief of police at the time in Allentown used to have swastikas and Nazi memorabilia in his office, which is
in
really,
his office
in Allentown, in the police department. Yes, the chief of police. So I'm just kind of reading some of these comments too as I go into.
Yeah, go ahead.
We've also had some cases more recent times where we have Facebook situation where these Facebook groups, they'll portray themselves as a community group. Some people will know exactly what I'm talking about here when it comes to Emmaus, but it started and run by some of the officers who don't feel the same way. Actually, when I went on my ride along, we had taken lunch back at the station, and it was a Saturday morning. I went kind of on a weird time because I want to see what the dead space looks like. What does the mundane stuff look like for an officer? And one of the things I found really interesting about that is, engaging with the officers. One, it's like, and during the boring time, some of these officers are itching for someone to commit a crime because they're bored. So there's the psychology of the officer itself that's like, okay, how do we keep it? But there are a few officers that they will encourage that type of rhetoric on a social media platform, and that's dangerous.
Yes.
That's just dangerous. Any kind of prejudice within the department itself, and I know that's kind of rooted in the culture, but I mean, we have to change that. How we go about changing that is weeding them out of the department and bringing in people who are cultured.
Well, Ashley, is that what you meant when you said the roots of the tree are diseased? Were you talking about this kind of bias? I'm wondering if that's what she meant. And Dahl has brought it up again here too.
Yeah, I see that. I was just reading that. I don't know if Ashley can hear us.
But how would we fix that? And what about screening aspiring police officers for, in some way that might somehow, detect if a certain ideological bias exists in an officer's thinking, or even racism, white supremacy, or even just a certain personality type that might be, a personality type that might in some way be more prone to fascist mentality than others.
I think a lot of that is where with Dahl's comment there, the root of the tree are diseased. The history of police work is rooted in catching slaves. Instantly, we're talking about a disease issue. We're talking about we're talking about a supremacy. All of it kind of intertwines there. And as we go through history and things, and then we look into like the civil rights, even this ties into even a bigger issue of our corporate conglomerates and our class warfare that seems to be happening right now, where our corporations can use our local law enforcement to enforce what they need to have happen. And there's another systemic issue in that as well. But these policies are what's been creating, it's perpetuating this disease.
You mean corporations making sure that protests don't happen?
Well, you think about that's what I'm saying. Going through history, you think about like during like the Rockefeller's time, where we start to see the unionization of our workers and our workforce, and how law enforcement was able to, in scenarios where they were able to open fire on protesters just searching for equal rights for workers' rights. We see incidences of this disease spreading all throughout our history, through the civil rights movements in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And now we're seeing a new form of it today. It's like it's adapted as time goes on. And so far, no one's really, these policies that we put out, like the 8 Can't Wait is a great policy platform. And I was happy to see that our local law enforcement had adopted it way ahead of this whole crisis in our civil rights movement now. But at the same point in time, it's a Band-Aid. That's all it is. It's a Band-Aid over a disease root that is just going to keep perpetuating if we don't continue to keep moving forward and changing and diversifying and bringing behavioral health in and looking at innovative ideas and how do we get communications right? How can we hold the officers accountable? These policies should be public information instantly because there is a sense of accountability. If I mess up at my job and cause harm on someone, one of my coworkers, they're within their right to fire me. I'm being held accountable. It should be no different for our law enforcement. In fact, they're a public figure, and I would think that they're held to a higher standard because they do have the authority to have lethal force. So this is backwards. This is all backwards. We're just perpetuating these systemic issues.
Right. Okay. Arthur Lewis Benson, who is one of the conference organizers, actually says a lot of officers are ex-military, not to denigrate the service, but they are trained to fight wars, not police civilians, unquote. What about the militarization of police departments? Is that an issue locally, or is it about the equipment, or even if it's not about the money and the equipment, is there an attitude that comes from people from the armed services that is, bent towards toward combat?
I think that's actually a very good question to ask in this case. there's I actually have some level of PTSD myself from my own past experiences. I wasn't a service member or anything, but I understand that I do have a taste of it. I can't say that I've experienced what our soldiers have gone through, especially in recent times in Afghanistan or Iraq or
Mhm.
any other conflict that we've been engaged in over the years. But you got to worry about bringing some of these individuals into our local law enforcement, because that is a volatile. And again, you'll hear me. I have a constant theme here. I'm driving home. Behavioral health. This
Mhm.
comes down to the health of the officer as well. How psychologically capable is that officer
Mhm.
to not use that force, to not black out? I mean, when you're being triggered at PTSD, if you're triggered hard enough in the right kind of way, you're going to lose all touch reality. And now you're using a method to arrest somebody that's inappropriate and frankly murder. So there's a fine line with our military service veterans, depending on where they come. Now, on the other side of this, I've also engaged with ex-military who are officers who are trained in the de-escalation a little more thoroughly, and they've had to de-escalate serious conflict in a war zone without because their rules of engagement are a little more strict, and they follow this rule of engagement. Our officers have less of a strict rule of engagement than our military does when dealing in an actual combat zone.
Mhm.
You don't
Mhm.
fire unless fired upon. There are certain things that have to happen in order for them to actually engage in the enemy with lethal force. Our officers don't have that. Most of our departments, their policies are set up to protect the officers so they can engage whenever they feel like their life is threatened, as much as, like Ashley was saying earlier, as much as
Right.
simple as clenching a fist and making a gesture towards an
Right.
officer could constitute being threatening enough to that officer where they can justify lethal force. So I've seen this either way. I've seen in cases where the PTSD is too much and they're being triggered in certain areas of being out on patrol, but also at the same point in time, I've also seen these cases where their de-escalation technique and their rules of engagement are so embedded in their system that they're actually a healthier police officer for it.
Right.
So it's either or right now, for me at least, in what I've seen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. And of course, the laws that protect police officers and that tend to forgive them for violent actions have been there for a very long time. And the idea of bringing ex-military people into police forces, of course, makes a lot of sense because they're capable and they're trained to handle crises against violent enemies. And in cases where there are real criminals doing really violent things and evil things and using weapons and so forth. But but the question came up about the education of police officers. It's one thing to screen them for personality disorders or PTSD or what have you. But should criminal justice be perhaps a graduate degree instead of an undergraduate degree? For a couple of reasons. One, so that we'd have more educated police, and two, so that college students from many disciplines might aspire to become police officers, the kind of police officers who are allowed to carry weapons.
Well, right now, as it stands, you really don't even need a degree to be a officer. I mean, in a lot of cases, you really just need to have graduated high school, pass all the background checks, and then they'll train you. I had one chief tell me, he said, I can train anybody. Which I'm saying this lightly. I can train anybody to be an officer. I can't train an officer to be a behavioral health specialist. I can't train an officer to be in communications that can offer that element of transparency that we need in the 21st century. I can't train an officer to be a secretary or not to use the word secretary, but administrative is what I was looking for. Administrative assistant, or there's all these different hats that these officers wear, and that's not their field. So we have this expectation of them right now. And while some of them are actually decent people trying their best, there's also, there's a social media. There's another program called the Hub, and there's Neighbors. There's different apps now where for community police work that can actually engage. You can engage as a community member with the police department. They kind of monitor this chat box. We have something called the Neighbors app in Emmaus. I know there's another app I want to look into soon called the Hub that they're doing, I believe, in Lower Macungie Township. So you have officers doing this, people with generally high school education who are trained to shoot and patrol and what the numbers and laws and pass an exam. That's it. That's really it. So, I mean, I think just to start would be making it a requirement to have some sort of degree.
Right. Anna is saying state police need a 2-year degree, but it's not subject specific. That must be new. I know guys my age who became state police officers who right out of high school or who flunked out of college in 1 or 2 semesters and still went on to police academy and became state troopers. So that must have been some improvement in those requirements. Or now I want to go back to Peter has been saying a couple of things, and I don't want to. First of all, Shanta says accountability and transparency are key. Given if you give unlimited power, how can you monitor or hold police accountable? Patrick should absolutely have education requirements, considering that an officer is claiming power over a situation. It's Patrick McGee. And local police don't need any college education in many circumstances. That used to be true for sure, not so long ago in Pennsylvania. Peter says something interesting. Isn't it ironic that some of those sworn to uphold the law seem so willing to violate the law if it fits their personal prejudices? Really, really interesting point, Peter, about the roguery that somehow gets that is somehow unchecked in police forces, because when the police are given that extension of the sovereign power of the civil power of the state to decide, over people's lives and deaths, the law really isn't operating anymore in a crisis. Now, in theory and on paper and in the everyday, you'd see police, trying to follow the law like they will, but like in a crisis, and as Ryan pointed out, if someone has a PTSD condition, for example, and get triggered, they're not thinking about the law, they're reacting. And it's really, so in other words, they have the force of law, but you might as well cross out the word law and say, well, during a crisis, they have force only.
And Mike, I know we're kind of running out of time here, just kind of glancing down here, but I want to touch on the next comment after that.
Sure, go ahead.
I will totally mess up the first name if I try to pronounce it, but Lopez is the last name, it seems like. In my work with police, I believe we don't take into account how much they experience trauma. And you know what? I just really want to touch on that before we kind of wrap this up.
Okay, we have a minute.
Yeah,
so go ahead, Ryan.
I'm gonna make this real quick.
Okay.
Trauma is what came to my head the second George Floyd happened. Trauma. The very beginning of this, trauma. How much of our officers are out there in trauma? Then the riots started happening and protests, and you've got officers with trauma shooting gas at inner city communities with trauma. You have all this trauma that is budding. They don't like each other at all, and it's escalating. Trauma. Right. We're not just looking to take care of the psychological well-being of the community, but we also want to make sure we're taking care of the psychological well-being of our officers.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Ryan. Okay. It's 10:45 now. We're going to have to wrap this up. Ryan, thank you so much for being here, sir. Really invaluable contribution to this conference so far and getting off to a fantastic start. Again, thank you to all our participants. Ashley Strange, thank you so much for being here and for taking us through those slides and pointing out to us the facts about what's been going on locally. Okay, I'm gonna copy and paste my question. Again, this is the uniform question that we're going to ask at the end of every panel. Keep it in mind for every panel that you go to, please write to us. Please go back to the conference website, write prompts in the gallery, make a Flipgrid video if you want, socialize with each other in the lobby or in the lounges. I'll see you there. Okay, thanks again, everybody. Ryan and
Thank you.
Ashley.
Thanks,
you so much.
everybody. Thanks, Mike.
Too.
Thanks for doing an awesome job moderating. 11 o'clock is Bart Bailey is going to be presenting on healthcare disparities and COVID-19. I hope to see you all there. Ryan and Ashley, if you're around to continue the conversation with anybody, or anybody wants to continue the conversation, please do so in the lobby or the lounge. Fantastic. We're off to a great start. Round of applause for everybody. Okay, we're going to take a break and we'll see you all at 11 o'clock.
Thank you
Feel
so
free
much.
to go to the lobby and hang out.
Thanks, everybody.
All right.